Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. I'm going to share some notes and thoughts about my first 5 hours playing Ghostwire Tokyo on the PlayStation 5. I love the horror genre in movies and in shows. I cannot handle it in games. It gets too intense, all the jump scares, and usually there's difficulty, lots of dying involved in like survival horror games, quote unquote. But I love the horror genre in other mediums and would love to be able to enjoy it in video games as well. And the TLDR version of this review, I guess, would be that if you like Far Cry games and the basic gameplay of Far Cry games, and like me, you really enjoy horror but don't like to be scared while you are playing games, maybe tense but not scared, and you don't like difficulty that involves dying repeatedly, then Ghostwire Tokyo should maybe be on your radar for consideration. I became interested in Ghostwire Tokyo because there was some pre-release content that compared it to Far Cry. Beyond that, I didn't check out much pre-release content at all, but I would say that after 5 hours with it, that's a pretty good comparison in my mind. It's set in Tokyo, and there's a strange fog that sweeps over the city, seemingly killing most people in a sort of like classic, in terms of how it's portrayed in fiction, rapture-like fashion that just leaves their clothes behind and their bodies they're just gone. The main character mysteriously survives this, just barely though, mainly because a ghost latched onto his body, and now these two characters, the ghost and the living main character, are struggling against each other for control over the body. They quickly realize they're going to have to work together to find and save the main character's sister, who is somewhere in the city and needs rescuing, and then at the same time they are hoping to defeat the evil that has done this to Tokyo. I mean, they'll probably have to do both at the same time. So you're in search of your sister, and you're exploring this open world city, defeating evil spirits called visitors, and that's done either through upfront combat or stealth tactics. That's where it really can feel like a Far Cry game, is that whether you do like an upfront in their face, now I don't want to say melee. You can build your skills a little bit so that it's to your advantage to get up close and personal, but you can also approach combat from a good distance away. It's not going to keep you safe, but I mean that is an option to you. And so between like upfront combat or stealth, kind of like quick kills from behind, you're becoming more powerful as this practitioner of the magic arts that you've just discovered, and with the help of your ghost friend that's in your head. And it's in a first-person perspective, and the spell animation's really cool. Lots of like, your hand movements are very interesting, and then also lots of colorful spell effects and stuff. So it feels like Far Cry, but in this Japanese horror movie environment with a liberal dose of spectacular looking magic. Like early Far Cry games, you're basically exploring and unlocking areas of the map by going to key points and taking on some task there. Oftentimes there'll be combat either on the way or at that point, and then once you've taken care of whatever the task is, then you kind of unlock this point, and a radius on the map is opened up around it, revealing the rest of the map in that area. Now in Far Cry, you're just kind of clearing the fog of war for the most part, but in Ghostwire, you are actually clearing a literal fog that otherwise keeps you from going in a number of places in the city. So it's not open world from the very beginning. There are a number of alleys and ways that you can kind of get around the fog to slowly get to the shrines you need to get to, and then you cleanse the shrine, and then that's what opens up the area surrounding the shrine. So it's not completely wide open from the get-go. Let's see here. I had three basic elements of offensive magic. There was wind, which is the one you start with, and that's fast offensive magic with a low mana cost, for lack of a better word. They don't use the term mana. You've got water, which has this wider attack range that can allow you to hit multiple enemies in front of you at once, which is helpful. And then you've got fire, which basically just does more damage. And I think it has a staggering effect. Well, I think all of them have a little bit of a staggering effect, but fire is definitely the most powerful offensive element. You also do have a bow and arrow that's I found in the first 5 hours mostly valuable when you lose your magic abilities. Wah, 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 wah. There was a little tutorial screen that popped up at one point and says something about like fighting solo or going solo or whatever. And they said when you do not have your, whatever his name, Ghost KK is his name, is your ghost companion. When KK is not with you, you do not have access to most of your magical abilities. I'm like, oh my gosh. If it would have just been one story moment for a little bit where I had to get around town without my powers, then okay. But if you put up a tutorial screen and say, hey, when this happens, because it's gonna happen more than once in this game, I was like, oh, that was really disappointing. I read superhero comics to read about characters who have superpowers. And so likewise, I hate the comic book story that's done over and over and over again about the hero losing his powers and having to show us as readers that, oh, he's still a hero even without his powers. Like, I get it. I'm sure he's a great guy and very brave and heroic, but I bought this to see lasers come out of his hands. And so I really dislike this device. It does seem like it's going to be, certainly the minority, the exception to what the normal gameplay experience is going to be. On the easy difficulty, although things still felt dangerous now and then, I never died, even on the run or in combat when I didn't have my powers. And of course, the same was true when I did have my powers. And so, if as long as they are the kind of exception to the norm, I think it'll be fine. It did give me a reason to use the bow and arrow, which I didn't touch before. That I was like, why would I use a bow and arrow? I can do magic light ray shows out of my fingers. But when I did have to use the bow, I was like, okay, this isn't so bad. This is, kind of cool in some ways. But really, I get bows and arrows in Far Cry and in Skyrim and all kinds of other first-person games that are remotely like this. So I'm glad that it seems to be it's going to be the vast minority of the time that you will not have your powers. But, going forward, if I was wrong about that and they dipped into this mechanic more frequently than I want them to, that could have a huge impact on my enjoyment of the rest of the game. So we'll see. Additionally, though, just on the subject of difficulty, I suck at games, and so I do almost always, especially if it's an action game rather than like a turn-based RPG or a tactics game or something, I almost always default toward just the easiest difficulty setting that I possibly can, and that was the case this time. And so that helps. You can save anywhere at almost any time, and there are plenty of places and ways to get XP and money. I had way more money than I knew what to do with, which made it easy to have healing consumables, which also, interestingly, contribute in a small way to increasing your maximum hit points, in addition to giving you hit points in the moment. And so I think that's a really interesting mechanic that's going to allow me to potentially translate a lot of my funds into defensive buffs, like a permanent defensive increase. So all that to say, in part, those expecting Ghostwire Tokyo to feel like survival horror, I think are going to be very disappointed with this. I can't speak to the higher difficulties, but I think just the type of gameplay this is, it's not going for that. I do think, though, that it's potentially a horror game for horror fans who hate horror survival games because of the mechanics and difficulty that usually come along with those, or because they just lean too much on jump scares and things like that. So Ghostwire is tense and creepy, but I didn't find it punishing and filled with jump scares and frequent deaths. And so that makes me really happy as a fan of horror that wants a very different experience from what most horror games offer. The visual design in Ghostwire Tokyo is a big selling point for me as well. I mean, namely because of how much it feeds into the tone, the atmosphere, the vibe of being in this world. It uses the tropes of Japanese horror, which also has some of that Lovecraftian fear of the unknown I love so much. The atmosphere of the city is eerie. Everyone is gone except for these creepy humanoid spirits that are wandering around. There are also floating mundane objects like cars and toys and trash bins just slowly, gently bobbing up and down at a weird angle, and other things that will transform or animate that shouldn't do either of those things. It's a world that contains all the trappings of ours, but it's been altered in some way and has me constantly wondering what in the world happened to make it like this. What weird thing might I see next? Graphical fidelity is itself in this game not stellar, I don't think. I mean, I'm not a graphics snob to begin with. I think other people might end up being harder on it for that than me. It all works to convey the artistic design and tone for me very effectively, though, and that's what matters to me most when it comes to visuals. The audio design I felt like is solid, with rain effects that pulled me into the setting, and English voice acting that surprised me at how un-anime it sounded most of the time. There was maybe one or two brief examples. Despite the fact that this is made in Japan, and in particular, I enjoy the dialogue going on frequently back and forth between the main character and KK, the ghost that's sharing his body. Despite being similar to Far Cry in many ways, I find the protagonists to be much more interesting than almost any in Far Cry, and that's largely due to the voice acting as well as the dialogue writing. The combat isn't fast and frenetic in the same way that a lot of first-person shooters are. The spell animations do slightly slow down when that ranged attack actually fires off compared to when you hit the button to trigger it, compared to guns. It doesn't, to me, feel sluggish at all. And it has an energy to it that would be really cool to see in future Elder Scrolls games when playing a magic user. So there is a sense of speed that the animations lend to it, and then also, like I said, there's not a huge delay between pressing the button and the spell firing off. So it's neat. I've been enjoying the combat. The enemy AI isn't that smart, which is actually the way I prefer it most times, especially since you have a pretty effective block but no dodge option that I could find in this game. Thematically, I also like these enemies more or less to just come straight at you. That's what I would expect from ghosts, a lot more than them dodging and rolling or something like that. The open world is littered with side quests and collectibles, all of which seem to help you become stronger, either through money and XP rewards or other unique rewards that aid or make you more effective in some way, or boost like maybe a specific spell attack that you have. Traversal isn't quite as smooth as in Far Cry when you're kind of clambering over things, but is still largely solid, and the mystical grapple points, I would almost call them zip points, because you're not like swinging on a grapple, but there are these are spirit creatures that are harmless that just float around as strategically placed points, and you can focus on them, hit a button, and then you will zoom up to them and then immediately drop down below them, which can help you get high up to high buildings and things like that. There's also a gliding ability that you can even upgrade a little bit from where it starts that allows, upwards and downwards a lot of verticality to your exploration, which sometimes involved me stopping to think about, okay, how can I get where I want? I've got the fogs over there, and I've got this scaffold maybe I could go up. Are there any of those things I could grapple onto? So that was kind of like an interesting component, not full-on puzzle type stuff, but still just giving my brain 1 or 2 seconds to pause and think, in a way that I found satisfying. Now, as far as themes, is there anything of moral, philosophical, or spiritual significance going on in the themes of this thing that might trigger some worthwhile thought or conversation? Along with the Japanese horror setting and aesthetic comes a lot of Eastern mysticism and superstition. As a game mechanic, you regularly pray at idols, and the afterlife is unsurprisingly a regular topic in the dialogue and in the mystery. After praying now and then, the ghost in your head asks, "Found religion, huh?" To which your character responds, "At a time like this, yeah." And the main antagonist, you'll find recordings of him, or because I guess he's also kind of broadcasting on TV at the same time. There's a really interesting marriage of the supernatural and science fiction in this that in brief moments almost has a Ghostbuster type of vibe to it. It's that I find interesting. Anyway, but the antagonist talks about how our flesh, our bodies are just corrupt, and they're the source of all of our problems and our sin and stuff like that. Which sounds to me at least like one strand of Eastern thought, which would say that we want to detach ourselves from the physical world, and we want to enter into a purely spiritual state, and yet this idea is being attached to the enemy, to the bad guy. And so they're certainly playing around with a lot of these kind of themes that are found in Eastern religion, Eastern mysticism. Since I'm not familiar with the specific religious and philosophical traditions that they're pulling from here, I couldn't tell you how much it faithfully represents any real world views, any religious beliefs that are actually practiced today. In fact, to me, much of it felt like fantasy lore of some kind, especially with how they bring these ideas to life with such spectacle. However, it was sobering to me now and then as I was playing to think that, gosh, there are millions of people that believe in many of the superstitious ideas and the false ideas that are being presented here in some form or another. There are people that actually believe a number of these things about spirits, about life after death, and Christians with loved ones who hold some of these beliefs, or who maybe once held some of these beliefs themselves, may have a hard time playing this game, or find it wise to avoid altogether, given how filled it is from top to bottom with Eastern mysticism and superstition. Those looking for some biblical guidelines regarding if or how they should interact with this kind of entertainment, or who want some principles for how to interact with Christians who express concern over their enjoyment of this kind of content, will almost certainly find some helpful scripture in Romans chapter 14 and 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians chapter 8, I would definitely refer you to for this and so many other things related to enjoying geek entertainment. You're also invited to check out my video, Can Christians Be Evil in Games?, which takes a deep dive into the topic with relevant scripture throughout. Now, for my money, I really had a good time with the first 5 hours of Ghostwire Tokyo. I think there's a very good chance that I'm going to come back to it someday and play it all the way through. Right now, I'm still in the thick of Far Cry 6 and other games that have similar enough open world formulas that I don't feel like this is really going to fill a slot in my gaming right now. But the unique novelty of the setting for Ghostwire Tokyo, the cool visual execution of the magical combat, and even the story, which sets up a mystery that I really do want to uncover, despite the fact that I'm typically not interested in stories in games. All of that's likely going to call me back when I see this game on sale, which I think is fairly likely to happen before long if Deathloop is any indicator. For those who don't know, Deathloop, which is a highly celebrated and a much loved game that came out exclusively for PlayStation near the end of last year, it was published by Bethesda, and long after that game and Ghostwire Tokyo, also published by Bethesda, were in development, Microsoft purchased Bethesda, and so it's kind of speculated, I think, fairly reasonably, that Sony kind of didn't put much effort into marketing Deathloop, and Ghostwire Tokyo hasn't been marketed much either, because they are now Microsoft products. And Deathloop also saw a pretty significant discount not terribly long after it was released. And so in light of that, you might consider waiting, if you're interested in Ghostwire Tokyo, to see if in a month or two, like Deathloop, it sees some kind of a discount before long. Personally, I would probably wait until it's as low as $30 or $40 or even less. But whenever it is that I get back to it, and however low the discount might be, I suspect I'm going to have a really good time with Ghostwire Tokyo. And those are all of my thoughts for now. I would love to get yours in the comments below. Please like, share, subscribe, and click that bell to stay connected to this content. I want to thank the Spirit Blade Insiders for making this content possible. Summer Insanity is coming. Check out the link and info below. And as always, I hope you will check out the Christian Geek Central podcast and all of our other content over at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. Summer Insanity.
Liberate butter.